All right, so let's get it started. The decline in Mrs. Fields cookies. What happened?
Mrs. Fields is a chain of stores widely known for selling freshly baked cookies in malls throughout the United States and other parts of the world. Seriously, I think these are amazing cookies,
Yeah, I
and that
really love
seems to
Mrs.
be the
Fields
general
cookies.
opinion.
We
If
had
you
a
have
really
somehow
good one
not
here
had one
here in
before, I
Anchorage.
recommend you seek out a Mrs. Fields and give it a try. However, that is becoming more and more difficult. Despite receiving so much praise, Mrs. Fields has been on a constant decline for quite a while now. From what I
Really?
can tell, the brand was at its biggest in 1993 when it had 780
That's a lot
locations,
of
and over the past
locations.
3 decades, most of them have slowly shut down, with only about 250 remaining. I
Yeah,
know
the
that looks
one I knew
bad, and
here
the
is shut
reality of
down
the
too.
situation, I think, is actually much worse than that graph demonstrates. Compared to 30
Yeah, it
years
was
ago,
pretty
a
big,
much
I
higher
think. Well,
percentage
I
of
don't know
those
about
stores are
big,
either
but
in small
it's
kiosks
pretty
or
well
combined with a
known.
frozen yogurt concept called TCBY, the country's best yogurt, and to be clear, that is the name of it, not my own personal review. Not to mention that many more of them are now located outside of the United States, and all of them are now franchised. Even though Mrs.
Oh,
Fields still has high brand recognition, claiming that
franchise.
81% of the people in the United States have heard of them, I think that the perception of the brand is much different today. It is to a point where, understandably, many of the people watching this probably could not tell me much about the woman herself. You might even think that Mrs. Fields is some kind of fictional character, like Mrs. Butterworth, and that is unfortunate. Debbie Fields is, in fact, a real person. She was the one who started the company, turned it into a
Oh,
national brand. Throughout the 1980s,
I
she was
actually
almost
didn't
like an
know that.
icon for female business owners, and
I
probably
didn't
more
know
heavily
that. Mrs.
associated with
Fields was
cookies
real?
than anyone else
Oh.
on the planet. So in this video, I want to talk about the woman that's behind this famous brand, while identifying some of the biggest reasons behind its decline. You know, before Debbie Fields, the woman that was most associated with cookies was probably Ruth Wakefield. Yeah, there's
Oh.
something about the name Field. She is commonly
There is
credited
something
with
about the field,
inventing
huh?
the chocolate chip
Yeah.
cookie. She was in charge of a restaurant called the Toll House Inn, where she created chocolate
Toll
chip cookies
House.
by adding
Oh.
chopped up pieces from a Nestle chocolate bar into her recipe. Nestle bought the rights to print the recipe on their chocolate packages, and then
Oh.
millions of people used it to bake their own
They did,
chocolate chip
yeah.
cookies at home and maybe even discover their passion for baking. One of these people was, in fact, Debbie Fields. When she was 13 years old in 1970, she used that recipe to make chocolate chip cookies, where she
Wow.
became really good at it. Over the next few years, she modified that recipe until she developed it into her own. That was a big hit with all of her friends and family.
That's
When she was
cool. I didn't
18
know
years old,
that.
she met a
That's
man named
amazing.
Randy Fields, who was 10 years older than her and already a well established economist. She got married within the year, so she was in this situation where her husband and most of the people around her were noticeably older and more successful. As an
Oh.
uneducated teenager, she was feeling insecure about herself, living in the shadow of her husband and struggling to find
Oh,
her own
wow.
identity. She describes one particular incident as a tipping point, where she used the word orientated and was embarrassingly corrected to use the word oriented. After that, she became
Oh,
serious
I
about
didn't know
taking her
that.
passion for
Sad.
baking and
Oh.
turning it into a career. Against the advice of, well, just about everybody around her, the couple secured a $50,000 loan and used it to open her first cookie store. It was in Palo Alto, California on August 18th, 1977, which I just want to point out
Wow.
was coincidentally only a few months after the passing of chocolate chip cookie inventor Ruth Wakefield. Starting off my list, the first reason behind the decline of Mrs. Fields would have to be expanding too quickly. Mrs.
Oh.
Fields existed as a single
Yeah,
store
I
for
heard that's a
about
problem with some
2 years, but
companies
shortly after opening
that
the second
they
one, they
expand way too
started
fast in the
opening them at
beginning
what I
and
would consider to
things
be
dry
an
up.
irresponsible pace. At the start of the 1980s, she was practically unknown, and by the end of it, she was like a celebrity with her name on almost 500 stores across the country. But already at that point, things were getting shaky. Profits were up and down, and they were closing a lot of
Hmm.
underperforming stores. And trust me, many of them were struggling to find customers, they were in poor locations, and just not meeting expectations. So many of them were not selling enough cookies to justify the high rent that they were paying. According to Debbie Fields, they made some poor real estate selections starting
Hmm.
in 1986 based on the advice of outside professionals, and that was difficult, especially considering that there were additional factors complicating the situation, like the
I
next next
see.
one on my list, there was a rumor.
A
In the
rumor?
1980s, there was this
Hmm.
story going around about the company that I want to
Yeah.
make clear right away was completely false. But according to the rumor, a fan of Mrs. Fields' cookies wanted to make them herself at home, so she called the company asking for the recipe. Someone from the company said that they would send it to her for the price of $2.50. Naturally, she thought that they meant $2.50, so she agreed to it. But after receiving the recipe through the mail, she learned that her credit card had actually been charged $250.
What a
They
rumor to
refused to give her a
spread.
refund, so to get back at the company, she printed up a bunch of flyers with the recipe on them and started handing them out to just about everybody. Again, it was all completely made up. The company keeps the recipes secret and certainly does not sell them to people over the phone, but for whatever reason, there were these papers circulating with the recipe on them claiming to be hers. Now, I do not believe that this was
Wonder
a
why.
major
Who would
factor
do
behind them
that?
declining, but it is interesting to talk about, and Debbie Fields has acknowledged that it had a negative impact. She went so far as to put a note up in all of the stores addressing it and assuring the customers that the story was false. The other factor complicating things at the time was the economy.
The
Mrs. Fields
economy,
has
of
always
course.
sold high
Seems
quality
like no matter what
cookies
era
made
you're
with
in,
premium
the
ingredients that
economy
are
is a bit of a
bigger
mess,
and tend to
isn't
be
it?
more expensive than most
Capitalism
others
was a
on the
mistake.
market. In short, buying a cookie from Mrs. Fields is by no means a major purchase, but probably something that you might want to pass on if money is tight. On top of that, we also have to recognize that mall traffic tends to be lower when the economy is slow, so when everything slowed down in
Yeah.
the early 1990s, it hurt sales, which could be bad news for a company that was
It's true.
already
Malls are also
overextending
on a
itself.
decline.
I don't have too much to say here other than the fact that the performance at Mrs. Fields stores has been closely tied to the state of the economy, so I'm going to move on to the next reason behind the decline, which might just be the most impactful one on the list, and that is the fact that Debbie Fields was too controlling. She
Too
had so much
controlling.
pride in her
Hmm.
cookies that she did not want anyone out there messing them up. I mean, she would go around and visit the stores, sample the ingredients, test the cookies. She was becoming friendly with the employees, closing stores for the day that were
Yeah.
not up to her standards. The company would
Oh, no worries, Wolf. Yeah, the rumor was apparently someone claimed to, sell the recipe of the cookies through the phone. A rumor that was proven false, but, the court of public opinion, if they make up their mind, that's it, right? It doesn't matter if the rumor is true or not. So I can imagine that maybe had an impact on their cookies and sales if people are thinking, whoa, I can just get the recipe by calling them, right? Which is a mess. Which is messed up. I have to wonder who started that rumor. Because, that's just messed up. Who would do that?
refused to sell any cookies that had been out of the oven for more than 2 hours. According to Debbie Fields, it's the lack of perfection that drives me crazy. The disappointment and frustration are indescribable when I find
Oh,
my cookie standards aren't
high
being
standards right
met. Now,
there.
you might be wondering why this is even an issue. You typically want a business owner to be passionate like this, right? Well, not quite like this. I think you'll agree that this level of involvement is almost impractical when you have over 500 locations. A specialized, simple store
Yeah,
like this is
not easy
such
to
a
manage
perfect
500
concept to
stores, is it?
franchise. Have other people pay you to open their own Mrs. Fields, where they sell your cookies using your recipe and your ingredients. I imagine that many people were advising them to do this during that time, because that is what almost everyone else was doing. But because she was reluctant to give up any control to potential franchisees, she instead took out loans and reinvested profits to open
Oh,
her own stores.
All of the ingredients are made to her specifications, shipped pre-measured to each store. She hasn't franchised the
oh,
operation to ensure that control.
Which is still respectable, but I think proved to be a poor decision in this case. By 1993, after dealing with all of these negative factors for years, the company was no longer able to keep up with its debt payments, and Debbie Fields was practically forced to give up 80% ownership of it. In her own words, the only thing I could do was
oh.
swap my ownership for a reduction of debt. I didn't have a choice. It was like parting with my family, like
That's gotta
giving
be
up for
rough. It's really
adoption.
rough.
Those are strong words. At that point, she stopped leading the company, but continued to be a part of it as chairman
Yeah.
and consultant before leaving entirely a few years later. Obviously, a sad ending for her career with the company that she had built, but had she been more willing to give up more control while they were growing, they likely would not have had such an issue with debt payments, and she probably would not have been forced out of there. Following her departure, things
That's gotta
continued to
be
be tough for the
rough.
Mrs. Fields Fields brand, and I believe that is mostly attributed to the remaining two reasons on my list, starting with competition. Now, when it comes to grabbing something to eat at the mall, there are
Cinnabon.
more options today
Yeah.
than there ever were before. Back in the 1980s, the most concerning competitor was probably the Great American Cookie Company. The founder of it, Michael Coles, even said that
Never
part
heard
of
of
their
that before,
success comes from
actually.
the fact that they had to be aggressive in expanding just to keep up with Mrs. Fields. But during the 1990s, I would say that the more pressing competition was coming from pretzel makers. I have a video that goes into more detail, but Auntie Anne's was kind of leading the way while a bunch of smaller companies like Wetzel's Pretzels started popping up. Mrs. Fields' response to all of this was to try and maintain their market share by acquiring some of these other mall-based snack brands. All in the late 1990s, they bought Pretzel Time, Pretzel Maker, and the Great American Cookie Company. But you
Wow.
might see where this is
Well, how
headed,
about
because
that?
investing all of this money in mall-based companies in the 1990s may not have been the smartest decision, leading me to the final reason on my list: malls. On that first
Malls.
day in 1977,
Yeah.
Debbie Fields struggled to sell a single cookie for the first few hours, but things turned around when she started handing out samples in front of the store. Right there, she learned the importance of customers being exposed to the product. Malls became a logical spot for Mrs. Fields because people smell the cookies as they're walking by and want to
That's
buy one
true. That's
impulsively.
what I did at
And
the
the same
mall.
thing goes for the pretzels too. So by the 2000s, they were selling all these foods in malls that do not really sell very well outside of malls, while the popularity of malls was declining. And yet again, the economy was complicating things, even worse than before. In short, they sold off all of those other brands that they had bought about a decade earlier, and shortly after, filed for bankruptcy. However, they were still the owner of TCBY, the frozen yogurt company that they had bought in the year 2000. But by this point, just everything was declining. So in 2014, they came out with a new strategy where they would open co-branded stores outside of malls. The reasoning was that people would be attracted by the frozen yogurt and then want to get a cookie once they are in there. I mean, the logic makes enough sense, but I don't think there is much evidence to suggest that the plan has been
Yeah.
all that effective, because both brands have continued to decline even further.
Which is a shame,
Let me
huh?
know in the comments, what do you think about Mrs. Fields, both the person and the company? Despite so much of it falling apart, I think it's hard not to have respect for everything that she accomplished. And it's also difficult just not to like these cookies. It's not often that a brand declines
Yeah.
because they were too concerned with quality. As always, I want to remind you that my list does not
Imagine
include
about
every
that.
potential reason behind their trouble, just the ones that I found to be the most
That
interesting
being
and the
too
most
focused on
impactful.
quality
Let me know if you think something should be added
could
or
also be a
subtracted
downfall.
from it. And any other thoughts you have about Mrs. Fields, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.
Wow. That was a pretty insightful video, wasn't it? I had no idea about most of that. I mean, of course, I knew that, malls are on the decline and everything like that. Yeah. That's the video. Be sure to check it out yourself and give it a like. That's pretty insightful. I never knew that. A bit wild to think, isn't it? That if you're too controlling, huh? That's a lot to think about, isn't it? I never knew about that. Yeah, it's a really great, insightful video. I guess something to keep in mind, huh? For anyone trying to make a business, right? It almost sounds like a paradox, doesn't it? Caring too much about the quality? Yeah, history is always a good thing to focus on. Yeah, so, I mean, lessons you can learn from the past. Hopefully, Mrs. Fields can make a comeback, because I do really love Mrs. Fields cookies. I used to get them all the time at the mall. Yeah, let's see what people are saying down here. Yeah, it's both fascinating and sad to see that with the downfall of the mall, an entire ecosystem of companies and retail has slowly been dragged along with them. Which is a shame, really. It's a shame that malls are just falling apart. Yeah. Yeah, I agree, Coach Kadika. Yeah, perhaps controlling isn't the right word to use. Having strong quality control. But I guess if maybe people don't understand it and see it as controlling, to have high quality control. But especially if you're trying to make like a profit. still interesting to think about. And look at this, yeah. Okay, but the fact that Mrs. Fields cared about the quality of the cookies that much is really crazy to hear, seeing as we live in a society that has shifted from quality to quantity and is against the consumer experience. Yeah, I don't think Mrs. Fields did anything wrong in that regard, caring about the quality of her cookies. Maybe a bit excessive, but when the cookies actually are delicious. You probably should have high quality control, right? It's a shame that this happened to her, though. Well, that was a very interesting view, wasn't it? Business is always so complicated. I don't understand everything behind it myself, but just hearing about all of that, knowing what happened, I think it's a bit fascinating to hear. Yeah, that's true. If you expand more than you can keep up, oh yeah, it could be a bit of a mess, can it? Yeah, they try to do something great, but if you go too fast, go too far, you can't keep up, and then it collapses under its own weight. It's scary to think about, huh? I gotta admire people who try to run a business, start a business. That's a huge risk. Not just financially, but emotionally too, I imagine. I'm just thinking that, gosh, it would suck so much if you put your heart and soul into a business and then it just flatlines. That's sad. That's really scary. So big respect to the people who still at least try, even if their business falls apart, at least they tried. They put themselves out there. I think that's worthy of respect in its own way, especially for Mrs. Fields cookies. I mean, gosh, that poor lady. She got married so young, and no one took her seriously. And yet she had amazing quality cookies. Yeah. Well, that was a good, insightful video. Be sure to check it out. Give it a like. This guy does really great, business breakdowns and stuff.